Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are pulling apart something really fundamental to how any organization works: corporate governance.
Right. It sounds a bit formal, maybe even dry.
Yeah, exactly. But it's essentially the system, the rules and practices for how a company is directed, how it's controlled.
It's all about accountability, fairness, and, well, making sure the organization sticks around. Longevity.
Absolutely. And it touches like everything: big boardroom decisions, how employees get treated, the whole lot.
It really is the, let's say, the operating system for an organization's integrity. Its long-term health. Without good governance, things can just fall apart.
Mm-hmm. And to really get our heads around this, we're digging into a pretty interesting mix of sources today.
We are. On one hand, we've got this really comprehensive guide. It's the Code of Best Practice of Corporate Governance from the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance, the IBGC Code.
Think of this as like the gold standard, maybe, a detailed blueprint for how governance should work ideally.
Yeah, it's a serious piece of work. Took a committee nearly 2 years, heaps of public input, over 350 comments, I think.
Huh.
It represents a really well thought out framework.
Okay, so that's the ideal side. And then on the other hand, we've got something, well, much more raw.
Definitely different.
Yeah.
A bunch of online comments, people reacting to a real world situation involving Klarna, the fintech company.
Right. Talking about their AI use, their recent performance dips, changes in how they handle customer service, that kind of thing.
So it's the theory meeting the messy reality, you could say.
Exactly. The principles laid out neatly, and then the public's take on events that maybe don't quite align with those principles. Or at least that's the perception.
Yeah. So our mission today is basically to take these core ideas from the IBGC code, the principles, the structures.
Yeah, and use them as
Well,
a kind of lens, right? To
right.
look at what's being said about Klarna in those comments.
Precisely. We want to pull out the important bits, the real nuggets about what good governance looks like on paper and the kind of challenges it bumps up against in the real world.
Yeah.
Especially now, with things changing so fast.
Okay, let's start there then. Laying the groundwork with that IBGC code, what's it trying to do? Who is it for?
Well, the interesting thing is its scope. The code says it applies to any organization. Business, sure, but also nonprofits, co-ops, even government bodies.
Any size, any type?
Yeah. Though it's mainly focused on business reality. The idea is these are principles any organization can look at and adapt.
Right.
It's meant to make the whole environment stronger, fairer, more accountable, more transparent.
So flexible, not just rigid rules for big corporations. And it boils down to some core principles, like the absolute fundamentals.
Exactly. 4 core principles. These are kind of the non-negotiables.
Okay, what's the first one?
First up is fairness. Simple word, big meaning. It means fair treatment for all shareholders and stakeholders.
Stakeholders meaning employees, customers, suppliers, the community, everyone involved.
That's right. And the code is really clear. Discriminatory attitudes,
Yeah.
unacceptable. Full stop.
Okay, fairness. Got it. What's number 2?
Number 2, accountability. This is huge. The people in charge, the code calls them governance agents. They have to answer for their actions or inaction and the consequences.
Right, so no passing the buck. You make the call, you own the outcome. Makes sense. Third.
Third is corporate responsibility. This is about the long game, ensuring the organization is sustainable, built to last.
Not just about this quarter's profits.
Exactly. It means thinking about the social and environmental impact, too. Being a good corporate citizen, basically.
Right.
Building something that can thrive responsibly over time.
Okay, thinking long-term, wider impact. And the fourth one.
Transparency. And this isn't just, putting out data dumps. It's about providing information so stakeholders can genuinely understand what the organization is doing and why. Clear, accessible information. And it should be disclosed equally to all shareholders, usually publicly.
Right. So fairness, accountability, corporate responsibility, and transparency. Those are the big 4 pillars.
The bedrock, yeah. The code then builds on that, outlining the structure, ownership, board management, auditors, this fiscal council thing, different parts working together.
Let's maybe zoom in on one of the key parts. The board of directors. The code seems to put a lot of weight on their role.
It does, and rightly so. The board is like the crucial link, the bridge between the owners, the shareholders, and the management team actually running the show day to day.
And their main job is?
Oversight, primarily oversight, making sure management is working to create and protect long-term value. They're accountable to the shareholders for that.
So they set the direction, keep an eye on things, but they're not meant to get into the weeds of daily operations.
Exactly. The code is quite explicit. The board should not interfere in operating matters. But, and this is important, they have the right to ask for any information they need. From management, even from external experts if necessary.
Okay, so they have the power to dig deep if they need to. And what kind of responsibilities fall under that oversight umbrella?
Oh, it's broad. Big picture stuff. Corporate risk management is a major one. Identifying risks, figuring out the potential impact, making sure there are plans to prevent or deal with them. Also overseeing sustainability efforts, approving major policies like who speaks for the company, crucial succession planning for the top jobs, evaluating the CEO and other top officers.
Evaluating the CEO and approving their pay.
And approving compensation, yes, that's a big one. Think of them as setting the strategic direction and being the ultimate check on how management executes it.
That evaluation and pay piece feels like it could be, well, pretty contentious sometimes, especially when we think about some of those online comments later.
Absolutely. And the code knows this, which is why it spends a lot of time talking about the composition of the board, especially this idea of independent directors.
Right, independence. Why is that so critical?
Because the board's loyalty, their duty, is supposed to be to the organization as a whole and to all shareholders, not just, say, the controlling shareholder who nominated them or management.
So independence helps ensure they're looking out for everyone's interests.
That's the idea. The code actually defines different types. Internal directors, like employees or officers. External directors, who might have past links but aren't strictly independent. And then the independents.
And what qualifies someone as independent in this code's view? Are there specific criteria?
Yes, very specific. Things like not being tied to the controlling group or their relatives, not being bound by shareholder agreements, not having been an employee or officer recently within the last 3 years.
Okay.
Also, not being a major supplier or customer, not being related to other directors or managers, and basically only getting paid their director fees, not other significant compensation from the company.
So minimizing any potential conflicts of interest or undue influence. And the code actually recommends a certain number of these.
It does. It recommends that the majority of board members should be independent and that they should be hired through formal, objective processes.
A majority, that's significant. It really pushes for that objective oversight.
Exactly. It's seen as vital for things like risk management, evaluating the CEO fairly, and managing potential conflicts of interest effectively.
Which, thinking ahead again, connects directly to some of those Klarna comments, doesn't it?
It really does.
There was definite frustration voiced there about, how accountable is the leadership when the company's value drops significantly or strategic bets like the big AI push seem to backfire.
Yeah, people were asking, how does a CEO make what looks like a bad mistake and keep their job? Someone even mentioned pulling a Zuck, the idea that controlling voting shares might shield leadership.
So that really hits at the core accountability principle we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. The board's power to evaluate the CEO, to set compensation, is meant to be the key mechanism for that accountability. If the public perceives that mechanism isn't working or might be compromised, well, that's a governance issue.
And the code's emphasis on independent directors, on formal evaluations, is precisely designed to prevent that perception.
Right.
To ensure decisions are objective based on performance for the whole company.
That's the intention, yes, to ensure the board can act as a truly independent check.
The code even has specific suggestions for how independents should handle tricky situations, like if the CEO is also the chairman of the board.
It does. If those roles are combined, it suggests the independent directors should lead discussions where there might be a conflict, like evaluating the CEO's performance.
Makes sense.
And it even recommends that independent and external directors meet regularly without management or internal directors present.
Really? Why?
To allow for really frank, open discussion about management's performance, the company's direction, without anyone feeling awkward or pressured. It's another layer of ensuring genuine, unvarnished oversight.
Okay, so the board is central. Who else plays a key role in this governance ecosystem, according to the code?
Well, obviously, management itself, led by the CEO, they're the ones running the company, implementing the board's strategy.
But they're accountable upwards, right?
Absolutely. Officers report to the CEO, and the CEO reports to the board. Their primary loyalty, again, is to the organization.
And their responsibility extends beyond just the shareholders. The code mentions other stakeholders.
Yes, definitely. The code emphasizes management's role in building transparent, long-term relationships with employees, customers, suppliers, the community, everyone the company touches. They're also responsible for setting up internal controls, making sure information flows properly up to the board and this other body, the fiscal council, and ensuring duties are properly segregated to avoid problems.
Okay, that mention of employees and customers brings us back to another strong theme in those Klarna comments, the whole fairness aspect.
Right. There were some pretty strong comments, weren't there?
Yeah, things like describing the work model as dystopian, workers feeling ground to the bone, a lack of care for the employee experience, and huge frustration with the automated customer service.
And that definitely creates a tension, doesn't it, between the code's principle of fairness to all stakeholders and the perception painted in those comments.
It seems like people felt decisions were being made maybe around AI implementation, cost cutting that severely impacted the experience for employees and customers.
Exactly. The code would argue that treating all stakeholders fairly, building those long-term relationships, is fundamental to corporate responsibility and the company's long-term health. But the comments suggest a perception that perhaps short-term goals or efficiency gains were prioritized over that.
It's that classic on paper versus reality gap again. The governance ideal says, be fair to everyone, but the public reaction suggests, maybe not so much in practice, or at least that's how it felt.
Yes, and that links to the corporate responsibility principle, too. Some comments touched on companies boosting profits temporarily by cutting staff, with execs maybe leaving with golden parachutes before the real consequences bite.
Right, the pump and dump concern.
Which raises questions about prioritizing genuine company longevity and sustainability versus just hitting short-term targets, possibly at the expense of long-term stability.
Okay, so board management. Who else provides checks and balances in this IBGC model?
You have the independent auditors, the external firms that come in and check the financial statements.
Their job is basically to confirm the numbers reflect reality.
Pretty much. To provide assurance that the financial statements are fair and accurate. The code stresses their independence is key, suggesting they generally shouldn't be doing consulting work for the same company they audit, for example.
Another layer of independent verification.
And transparency around their fees, how much for the audit versus other services, is also important.
And then there was the fiscal council you mentioned. What's their role?
The code describes them as an independent control tool, primarily for the owners, the shareholders.
So like another watchdog.
Sort of. They give opinions on big proposals, changing capital structure, dividends, mergers. They look at financial statements quarterly, report errors or potential fraud to the board or shareholders. They can even hire their own outside experts.
And their independence is protected how?
The code suggests they shouldn't get variable pay, like bonuses tied to company performance, to keep them objective. Their compensation should be fixed and disclosed.
Okay. And lastly, the code tackles conduct and conflicts of interest head on.
Yes, a whole chapter on it. It hammers home that duty of loyalty. Again, directors, officers, their prime responsibility is to the organization and all shareholders.
And how does it suggest managing potential conflicts?
A big focus is on related party transactions. Deals between the company and, say, the CEO's other business, or a company owned by a major shareholder.
Ah, right. Those can look bad.
They need careful handling. The code says they must be on normal market terms, fully disclosed, properly approved, maybe even requiring independent valuations. It specifically calls out things like loans to controlling partners or top management, suggesting they should either be prohibited or subject to very strict policies and approvals.
So really trying to prevent situations where insiders might benefit unfairly at the company's expense.
Exactly, and avoiding compensation structures that might incentivize the wrong behavior or create conflicts. It's all about maintaining trust and ensuring decisions are made for the good of the whole organization.
Wow. Okay, so the IBGC code lays out this incredibly detailed, interconnected system. Checks and balances, independence baked in, clear responsibilities, all focused on long-term value, fairness, accountability.
It's a really robust framework, yeah. Designed to build trust and guide organizations towards sustainable, responsible operation over time.
Right. So now let's circle back properly to those Klarna comments, viewing them through this detailed governance lens we've just built.
Okay.
The criticisms we saw questioning the accountability for that big drop in value, the perceived unfairness to employees and customers from the AI push and service changes, the focus on short-term results, the sheer frustration with service quality.
They all seem to map onto potential weak points or perceived failures in applying those core governance principles, don't they?
It feels like it. The comments are like a public audit asking, where was the accountability? Did the strategy truly consider fairness to everyone? Was long-term corporate responsibility sacrificed? Is there enough transparency about what's really happening?
Precisely. And when you hear comments about leadership being potentially insulated, that pulling a Zuck idea, It directly challenges the effectiveness of the very mechanisms the code relies on, like independent directors and objective evaluations.
Yeah, if the public perception is that the system isn't holding leadership properly accountable, especially when things go wrong.
Then it raises questions about whether the governance structure is actually functioning as intended, no matter how well it's designed on paper. The public reaction becomes a sort of real-world stress test.
Though we should remember that nuance we picked up on earlier.
The point about AI maybe absorbing workload after layoffs rather than directly causing them?
Exactly, and that AI is still central to their strategy. It suggests the situation is complex, not just a simple AI failed, they backtracked story.
Absolutely. Real-world situations are always complex. These comments are a snapshot of public feeling, frustration, perception. They're driven by the outcomes people see and experience, the service they get, the news about job impacts, the company's financial health.
But they serve as a kind of powerful, if informal, stakeholder feedback, right? Which is something these governance systems are ultimately meant to listen and respond to.
Yes, especially under the principles of fairness and transparency.
Hmm.
Good governance should involve listening to stakeholder concerns.
So it really paints this picture of a potential gap between the ideal blueprint for governance structured, independent, long-term focused, and the complex, sometimes controversial reality companies operate in, especially with massive shifts like AI or intense market pressures.
Mhm. The code gives us the aspirational standard. The public comments show us the friction points, the scrutiny, the real concerns that arise when actions, or perceived actions, seem to diverge from that standard. That's often where the rubber meets the road for governance.
This has really hammered home that corporate governance isn't just some dusty rule book. It's absolutely fundamental to how an organization behaves, whether it lasts, and the trust it builds or loses.
Definitely. The IBGC code provides that detailed roadmap built on solid principles.
Yeah.
And looking at the Klarna discussion through that framework really highlights the real-world tensions, the pressures, the stakeholder backlash, the tough questions about accountability that constantly test those principles.
Which kind of leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to chew on, perhaps. Given these constant pressures for short-term results and the speed of change driven by tech like AI, how can stakeholders, whether you're an employee, a customer, an investor, or just someone in the community, how can we best ensure that organizations actually live by these crucial long-term principles of fairness, accountability, and corporate responsibility that are laid out in codes like this? What really stands out to YU from this deep dive